Hey everybody, if you haven't heard, this is Jesus is King, Kanye's new album. Yes, Kanye West has a Christian album. Whether he's a Christian, different conversation, but students are listening to it. Anyway, welcome to this video on discipleship. I have 4 things I would like to do in this video. I would like to thank some people, share some encouraging words, a few reminders, and for those of you who hang out to the end, share a brief teaching. Remember, I'm doing videos in replacement of actually all meeting together, since that's really hard on schedules. But number 1, first and foremost, thank you. If you're receiving this video, you are probably part of the discipleship conspiracy theory movement we have here on Corban University's campus. And whether your level of engagement is taking spiritual formation assessments or providing them to your disciples, whether you have a discipleship small group, just a student or 2 that you meet with, or if you're just the kind of person who has an open door to students, thank you so much. The difference this investment makes in students, I don't know if it can be overstated. I mean, I guess we could try, but as I think about the difference of discipling and the life of a student, the difference is tremendous. Just this last Friday, I was at International Chapel, in the Psalm Center, and one of my former students, Weiss, was up on the stage, and when asked, "What are you going to do to make a difference in the world for Jesus Christ?" his answer had to do with being discipled and passing on discipleship. And you know what? Last year when I was discipling Weiss, when I was in the week in, week out chaos of grading and writing and all these things, I don't know that I saw the difference week in and week out. I don't know if I did, but I'll tell you what, I see it now. The fruit is there now, and it makes a difference. So thank you for your level of investment in discipleship. It's really making a difference. And I want to encourage you, I bet you were busy. I bet if you're a faculty or staff, you've got emails, you've got appointments, you've got meetings, you've got stuff to do, and it piles up high, and yet students kind of come by your door, they linger after class, they seem to be trying to talk to you, and I just want to encourage you to continue your investment in them, that it makes a world of difference, and your sacrifice of your time for them is just tremendous. It really is. And just as a way of a reminder, a lot of students who I interviewed, they've said they really want a discipling relationship with the faculty or staff member. They really do. But their problem is often, I don't know who to ask. I don't know what to ask. And I'm just not even sure how to even begin asking for somebody to invest in me. And so I think what happens to a number of us is sometimes we just see students kind of lurking, hanging out after class, lingering, and it's almost like they're waiting for you to ask them, like, do you see me? And do you know what it is I'm looking for? Are you perceptive to see it? And I just think students are hungry for this, and I want to encourage you to keep on investing, to be committed to the students, and it makes a world of difference. So thank you. Keep it going. Third thing, I want to share a couple reminders. One of the big insights from our first Discipleship Conspiracy Roundtable meeting was the idea of goals-based discipleship. I know we had 2 sessions, but in one session, Tamara McGinnis got a group of us talking about this. What is goals-based discipleship? Because sometimes a discipling relationship can just feel infinite, like you could do this forever. And there's a sense in which that's true and good, another sense that that's overwhelming and somewhat depressing. If we're making progress, doesn't this get to a place of done? And even thinking through the biblical data a little bit, Paul was discipled by Barnabas, but later he separates from Barnabas. Paul disciples Titus, but then later he leaves Titus in Crete. Like Jesus discipled his disciples, but then he commissioned them to go. So there's this thing about investing in people with a purpose and then sending them. Maybe not sending them out as full functioning adult mature believers, but sending them at least to the next person to invest in them. So as a reminder, goals-based discipleship. If you're discipling students, what's your big goal? I mean, obviously you want to encourage them, you want them to grow, but is there something that you're asking them to do this year that you can bubble? Did we accomplish the goal? Yes or no? I mean, it doesn't need to be so narrow, but sometimes when we're just trying to help people grow in lots of areas, it becomes very muddy as to whether we're achieving those ends. And so by way of suggestion, we got talking about goals-based discipleship, which is to look at somebody and figure out what's the biggest need that they have. If they're a new believer, is it growing in knowledge? If they're a new believer, is it beginning to read the Bible for themselves? If they're more experienced, is it about prayer? If they're still yet more experienced, is it about how they serve and invest in others and thinking through character development? What is the goal that you guys are working on? And so I just want to remind you that sometimes in the busyness and starting groups or starting relationships, that can be lost. But once again, this is a great time, November, to re-clarify what goals are you working for with your disciple. One more reminder, I just kind of wanted to point this out over here, is that I shared this with you guys, back in October, I believe, a Discipleship Wisdom sharing page. And a few of you have added to this, which is nice. But there are just a number of topics that you can see. How do you recruit students for discipleship? What do you do? What are your objectives? What are your ideas? And just wanting this to be a general resource page. This was kind of one of the other things brought up at the Discipleship Roundtable meeting was resources and sharing wisdom. And so just as a reminder, that's there too. So thank you. Keep it up. It makes a difference. Don't forget about setting goals and aiming for something concrete and specific. And our last topic today, for those of you hanging out for the teaching at the end, is thinking about mature Christian students. And how do you disciple somebody who's maybe grown up in the church, has a lot of Bible knowledge? When you ask about their personal life, they seem to, pray regularly. Maybe they read the Bible often, or they're in a current study. Maybe they're even in charge of their hall, like an RA, or in their youth group, they're a leader. And they just seem to have all these earmarks of maturity that you're like, man, I don't really know what you need to be doing. Maybe you should be discipling me because you've got so much going on. That's so positive. And I want you to hear this. Be careful here. Sometimes we're quick to see a few earmarks in a person and assume maturity. By way of metaphor, my son is a middle schooler, and on his middle school football team, there is a 13-year-old boy who's 6'4". Now, that 6'4" kid looks like an adult until you talk to him. And you realize, oh, you're a 13-year-old still. I think sometimes this happens with students, and honestly it happens in our churches, and maybe even with us if we're being really transparent, that we have the knowledge really high, that bar is really high, and you ask about spiritual disciplines, and oh yeah, those are going too. And so we can have the appearance of maturity, but maybe it's just because we haven't pressed a little bit further. In fact, one of the ways that I press a little bit further, not to poke a hole in somebody, but to realize what is it that I can do for this person who's coming to me. They clearly are hungry for more. When I ask about Bible knowledge, check. When I ask about practices, check. I ask about service, check. And yet there is this hunger in them. One of the things that I do to sort of ask is go, on what level do you struggle with guilt? Well, what do you mean, Jordan? Well, do you find yourself sometimes feeling a lot of guilt about past sin in your life? Or if guilt isn't maybe how you process it, do you sometimes have a general feeling of being not enough? Like that you were working really hard and you do your best, but you just don't feel like you're enough. And I had a moment this week with a student this was my second meeting with them. They came into my office and they're like an RA. They do all this great stuff. And when I asked that question, poke. That hit hearts where they were like, yeah. Because sometimes these grown-up looking mature students are students who are really driven by achieving for God. But underneath all that achievement, underneath all the Bible studies, the Bible knowledge, the serving, the doing what's quote unquote right, underneath all of that is this deep pain of trying to be enough for God. Right? Like being fearful that if I don't do enough, I'm not good enough. And so sometimes with these mature-looking 13-year-old kind of metaphoric spiritual people, I want to encourage you to not get tricked and to think, well, they know a lot, they read their Bible, they're serving, maybe they're fine. I want you to not be fooled. And I want you to press a little bit deeper to see how far the gospel has really been internalized by them. And so I figure that out, by the way, by asking about their level of feelings of worthiness, their levels of feeling guilt or shame. And almost universally with these type of driven students, underneath all of this desire and achievement for God is really this worthiness issue. And so it's quite possible, by the way, for you to find an 18-year-old who's a mature Christian person who doesn't have this issue. But in general, I find a lot of students who are trying so hard that they're doing all these things, but underneath it, there's this real sense of, if I'm being honest, I don't feel enough for God. And so I want to share with you a little bit from a resource that I like to use with these students, and it is called the Sin Trap. And how the Sin Trap works, by the way, let me see if it's going to let me run this. Oh, it won't. Oh, no, it will. Is that basically the Sin Trap works this way. People make mistakes, they sin and they fail, and it's pictured as trying to push a boulder up a mountain right here. But they can't do it, so their head, it's red, they sin, they fail. And so they feel sad, they're looking down, they're really introspective about why they're not good enough, and they start beating themselves up with words like, I'm a sinner, I'm no good, I always fail, I'm worthless. And this goes on for days, by the way, in most people. And it's just the sense in which they feel shame. But after a while of feeling shame and knowing they should be better for God, they stand up tall thinking, I can do it. I can try harder, and this time I'll succeed. And so they retry pushing the boulder. They try to be good for God. They try to do everything right. They try to keep devotions for half an hour every day, pray 20 minutes before bed, memorize scripture, and feed the homeless. And they try. And they do good, actually, for a while, but eventually the weight of all of this crushes them. And as you can see, the cycle restarts. And the reason this doesn't really work is it really has flawed theology, because this circle is driven by shame and students failing, beating themselves up, and thinking that they can do it. And both the shame and the thinking you can do it is really the problem with this model. And so I often try to teach students how to gospel themselves. Gospeling themselves is bringing them back to what the gospel says about themselves, because underneath maybe their desires to achieve is this deep-seated fear that they're not enough, which is a place that they have not yet received what the gospel says about them. And so typically the pattern starts the same. People still sin and fail all the time. But what happens next is so important. Instead of sulking and feeling bad, instead of telling myself I'm no good, I remind myself of what the gospel says about me now that I'm in Christ, that I'm God's child, that I'm loved, that I'm forgiven, that God is pleased with me. And this person, instead of looking down and weeping, is reminding themselves by staring at the cross what the gospel says about them. And then this person then says, apart from you, I can do nothing. This is so different than I can do this on my own strength. I got this. This is nope. I don't want to take 2 steps in this day without being in prayer and dependence upon you. And that's the new focus. And here's the thing that happens is they kind of resume their spiritual journey, but they're not looking at the rock. That's why the rock is somewhat dotted lined. That's not their focus, is beating this challenge. It's, I just want to stay focused on Jesus. I want to remember who I am. And I do believe, by the way, that people still sin and they fail, but this pattern is actually transformative because it leads us back to our God-given identity and the means of empowerment, which is relying on God. Apart from you, I can do nothing. And I share this with those of you who are still hanging in for this teaching because I think this is one of the chief things that we can do with those students who are more mature, which is to really get at that second quadrant, which says, do you experience this negative self-talk? How do you engage in it? And do you have a practice of gospeling yourself in the truth that you actually are loved and worthy? So I might teach students practices like memorizing key scriptures around their identity, telling them to not read their Bible for a month and engage in silence instead, trying different things to help them realize that God's view of me is not based on my performance. And for these achieving types driven by self-rejection, sometimes you need to take away the things that make them feel validated so that they can actually find it in who God says they are. Don't be fooled with these types. We want to be there to encourage deeper levels of growth and them receiving who Jesus says about them. Thank you guys for staying in to the end. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It's making a tremendous difference. I'll see you guys in January when we have our next roundtable meeting. Goodbye.